There you go. I couldn't believe it where he said.
Yeah.
He's like.
So-
Dave years ago. Right? Yeah. Training. He has a big guys.
Going to property that's going up for an office, public office.
Well, I had I bought it. I don't think 70. It's always, it's written by 15 Uber, but no appraisal gaps. That's how everybody's winning if it's appraisal gap. And she doesn't have enough money. She drove by this one. I think she has a better chance of an option. I said, you do know that the number that they put out there is starting.
You might just do Gary just get.
Right.
Order that second.
Okay, no, yeah.
She goes, no,
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, right click.
and we ran that.
That's
That's the starting.
that's the number they put out there to
Right.
dangle the worm in the water for all the fishies.
So I said, unless they want at least to that number, and they know they're gonna get over that. You're. But anyway, yeah, she drove by and things.
I bought 3 houses.
I think they're running by the way your email.
So we
In
there,
person auctions or online?
Yeah,
The online or.
oh, yeah.
so in person, okay, so I got 2 people, I have. Well, and you guys do things different here, I bet it wasn't.
Okay, where do you want, I can move.
So,
Depending upon.
You know, this is.
MLS.
One, they bought the guy. 45
Yeah,
days seconds,
around.
and they had some stuff to get out and said, hey, can we do this? Yeah, I don't care, you know, as long as.
Hey, good morning.
My other,
Good,
you know, so we worked with them and. Yeah, I mean, the other option I bought was 30 days, but
30 days what?
30 days settlement. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, you got to pay taxes that.
Right.
You're in.
That's what I did, yeah, you bring all cash, they allowed 30 days on them.
Yeah, most of them are at least 8 days, and, but yeah. And, you know, see you, if it doesn't go through, you.
We have.
Whether it's your fault, anything on your end. Unless you can make, and that's what the one place. Once there was back and forth, I was like, okay, so. They were used to it, so the other often. Nope, this is 3 days, I think. That's. It's. It's very exciting.
Yeah, so that.
You need to tell your client, put their hands in their pockets, to get to that certain, you know, they gotta have that number.
Black owls.
Yeah, everything's a little bit different. I don't. Yeah.
The fact the place we're working on now about it and all. And we're.
I had my own paper, I let it lapse.
Party. We had our limit round.
Yeah.
Just above there, but the guy who didn't want to. A real big,
That, yeah, we're 14.
Yeah.
Fine.
big flipper, big, a lot of them properties, and he dropped out. That big. I know a couple other, and it's like he has his limit.
Cause he's gotta make money.
Yeah.
Yeah, she doesn't.
So that's cool, okay, well, so I might be calling back.
Yeah.
If that, I hope, I mean, I don't wanna talk her out of it, I just wanna make sure. How do I get?
Talk with the auctioneer, if you're ready, get your client registered with the auctioneer, and registered with the, then they will give you.
We're in the,
And the auction.
sample, like we couldn't even print them, I think we had to use that.
Yeah.
Usually 10% sample. Yeah, I just.
Cause I guess, you know, at that point, they know if you're a realtor, you got a client there, they're probably qualified.
Yeah. Right.
Yep.
Okay, all right, well, I kind of figured some of this, so.
Every day's an adventure, isn't it?
Real estate, I don't forget, what is the best day ever?
Yes, please. Well, I was gonna ask you, like, jump in. If there's a way you want your agents to do things, let's say some things.
Oh,
Yeah, definitely jump in.
Kathy and I went to an auction, who knew the auctioneer from 4-H and all that. So we were standing side by side, and we were here and here, evening services. Forget what it was. It was like, I wanted to ask you, to be over. Yeah. Okay. So it came up.
Was it?
I did, and she didn't see me bid, and she turned around. Yeah, there. We lived against each other.
How does?
Yeah.
Maybe they work with my head.
Related?
Oh,
Heard something very
I
similar.
just thought we gotta go the order, like, when you meet somebody over there. Yeah, yeah. I'll let you know.
Anything more on the CBC. Actually, but I don't hear about something about that too. Like the Maryland office, that's who it.
about 5 minutes.
Asked her if she's gonna be at Zoom today. You ask her a question.
Sends videos.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
We can hear
Well,
you.
Nicole said she's gonna join online because she's still waiting for flooring people.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can grab a packet for,
Yes.
I'm sure you'll.
She has this stuff already, but I'll take her.
Yeah, I think she's gonna zoom it.
She did go to Gary's
Yeah,
seminar in Harrisburg too.
yeah, she said it was amazing. So,
Well, I think yours is. That
yeah,
is,
he's a good.
yeah,
presenter.
because when you
It's
took
been
that,
a
I'm
while.
like, it's like,
Yep, yep.
all right, then.
I think Reed's gonna try and call in. He was gonna come in with his leg bothering him, so he's gonna do. Yep, did you hear it? Looking for, yeah, yep.
He should go to Sunnywell, get comfrey, because that helps your bones.
That's right. That's right. Surgery coming up.
Mhm. Yeah, we lost. Weeks ago, we can see where. It's been a whole, I was glad to see September. So. People were had seen.
Wow.
Put in her hot dogs.
Oh,
15 years.
Look, was. Well, I want to make
yeah.
it.
Lori.
Yeah, they were away from King.
Oh.
I'm trying not to say it in text, but just check in on it. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Well, ours is still right.
Still, it's always,
Oh, I know. It'll be, there's a hole.
They're never with us long enough. They're members of the family.
That's right.
Yes.
yeah, your, yeah, is my other check for 2016. I just, Kristen couldn't find me. Rhonda couldn't find me. I just went to the bay and I. Here's your spot.
Haven.
Morning. How about
You haven't seen me forever?
Oh, it likes that.
Does it? Well, I don't get someone. Yeah, so I wouldn't know if it's your reason. Jeremy and, they're pretty good. They did really good. And Jeremy.
Here, Pale is right there. Pale is right there. All right. I guess I'm taking over the seat.
Got
Good, how are you?
It was, I mean, his, here.
Yeah.
Area. Possibly going to Carlisle tomorrow or Friday.
What are you going there?
Carlisle, flea market.
Oh, are you serious?
Yeah,
Is it specifically an automotive flea market? Or?
yeah,
Okay.
this is the fall Carlisle,
So I want.
everything.
I'd like to do that sometime.
This. And then Hershey is the following, is next week. That's a lot of walking. Hey, you gotta see that. Hershey is fun because of that is when you do the judging. You get to see these cars. So, yeah, and then turn it out. They have to come in and out in their own powers. You get to see these brass cars, Stanley steamers, you know.
Yeah, I have a friend who just got done, I think last week or the week before. He was one of the drivers, drives the cars in and out. I don't know if it probably wasn't in Hershey, but somewhere. Apparently that's a pretty big honor to be able to do that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Or he was at Meekums in the workshop. That was, I've never been to that. I wouldn't.
Yeah, I'll have to ask him where that was.
Wow. This, I've gone up to Hershey a couple of times and there's people that, I mean, they dress up in period clothing. They have like all types, just a regular picnic. They drive this, you see, you know, Duesenberg and they're just.
Yeah. Wherever he said it was.
Yeah, okay.
Because somebody said. It's tough just to get them in and out.
Yeah.
So, a little bit of stress involved.
Oh, yeah. Well, Beacon is in July, up in the heck, up the Carmels. So that's bringing a pretty big crowd. Then, yeah. Just something that.
And get started.
Get hurt.
Gary due today. I thank it for taking the time to spend with you all. Actually, Will was able to connect us, and I think this is a good refresher as we are now fully transitioned into the new documents. Sure, there's more questions. You're probably seeing a lot of agents do things differently, so you want to know what the right way is, and Gary's here to solve all that. Gary has a really lengthy resume. He served on many boards through the state and local boards. So, like 31 years of experience.
Yes.
So, comes with a lot of experience and knowledge. So, let's welcome Gary. Again, thank you for all coming. And you got your packet in front of you. Yeah, thank you.
I'm a very informal instructor, so this is about just having conversations. So at any time, if you don't understand something, just stop me. I'm happy to engage. The only thing I ask is that we don't, for code of ethics reasons, we don't discuss other agents by name. And since we are different brokers, I'm going to use crazy numbers when I talk about commissions. So don't tell me exactly what you're using in your listing contracts or your buyer's agency, just make up a number so that we're not in violation of any antitrust laws, okay? If people are on Zoom, can they get in or ask questions or just wait till the end or?
Yeah, they should, it should pop up. But
Okay,
if you guys are on Zoom and if you want to just unmute yourself to ask questions, that'd probably be the best.
yeah, that's fine. So in the back of your packets, I apologize, they were in order, but then I remembered I wanted to go over it a different way. So just a couple quick things, and I asked Will to jump in at any time because he's your broker, you got to do things the way he tells you. So if there's, when I'm saying something, if there's, I told him to jump in if he wants you to do it a certain way. Just at a high level, so the changes really aren't that bad, although it seems like they're a lot, they're really not. So if you break down the NAR lawsuit, the number one thing is we can't offer cooperating compensation in the multi-list anymore. So that's one big thing. The second big thing is you can't show a buyer a home without having a buyer's agency agreement signed with them. The reality of that is you should have always had a buyer's agency agreement signed with a buyer anyway. why would you work for free and not have any commitment from another person? People are often afraid to get forms signed. You can't see the doctor without signing 10 forms before you leave the waiting room. We're no different. We deserve to be paid for what we do. You have to just explain your value. So can't show a house without a buyer. Now, there's an exception to that, and we're going to talk about that when you show your listing to a sign call. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So you can't show houses without having a signed buyer's agency agreement. You can't offer cooperating compensation in the multi-list. And you can't collect more from your buyer than is on your buyer's agency agreement. So that's a huge change. Before, if we put 10% on our buyer's agency agreement, but they paid us 15, we could accept the 15. Now, if we put 10% on the buyer's agency agreement and the co-broke's offering us 15, we can't take that 15. We can only take 10. You could put in the agreement of sale that you want that extra 5 to go towards your buyer's closing costs, or what used to be seller's assistance. It's now called seller concession. So that's how you can still use that money from the seller. You're giving it to your buyer. You can't keep it. You could keep it. I'd love to hear what the dialogue would be if you could convince your buyer to go back and change your buyer's agency agreement from 10 to 15 when you found out you're getting 15 instead of 10. So if you meet with them initially and say, I'll work for you and I only need to make 10%, and then you go back and say, well, I'm really greedy. I found out they're giving me 15. Will you collect 15? So I'd love to hear how that dialogue goes to get them to initial the change to your buyer's agency agreement, but it's legal. You can do that. I don't know of anybody that would, but you can. So is everybody with me so far? Okay. So the reason I wanted to go over this first notice of change is this was designed, we were in the task force and it kept coming up. But as of the effective date of the changes, what do people do with all the contracts that are in play? This was primarily designed to avoid having to relist your properties. So this was really designed to not have to get a new listing contract. Buyers were fearful that if they said to the seller, we have to sign a new listing contract, that they would lose the listing. So this was just a notice we asked them to sign. And the biggest thing was our listing contracts prior to the change used to say that we will communicate the buyer's agent fee in the multi-list. And after the effective date, we couldn't do that anymore. So number one, under cooperating compensation, it says where the policy change is going to affect any offers of cooperating compensation currently communicated in the multi-list will be removed automatically without any change to the listing contract. So if you had listing contracts in place, technically you should have one of these signed by your seller immediately after the change. Of course, the date of the change forward, you're using the new listing contract, so it's not a problem. It did not cover the fact that the buyer's agency agreement says you can collect whatever they pay. So you would have to have all new buyer's agency contracts after the things went into effect. But this just goes on to talk about seller's assistance was changed to say seller's concessions, and that buyer's agent contracts, the broker may not retain a fee in excess of what's negotiated in the agreement. And that wasn't currently in the buyer's agency contract, so that's why you needed new ones. This form will go away. It's almost like, remember when we were in COVID and we had the COVID PAN form reminding everybody you're operating in an environment of a pandemic and you're running the risk of getting COVID if you're out with me, and and we don't, who uses COVID PAN anymore? It's like getting the flu. So this will probably go away. It was designed to help you not getting into having to do a new listing contract. Is everybody comfortable with this form? I don't want to spend a lot of time on something you're comfortable with. Are you all using it? The way I look at these three forms, this one, the bright form, is when you sit down with somebody, the first form you have them sign is what? Consumer notice. So now you have three notices. You have the consumer notice, you give them the NPC form, and you give them the bright form. So those are the three forms you want to always have in your file. The bright form then is the most, I think it's the most poorly designed form as a forms person. that there could be. It's horrible. Because it's kind of confusing. So you fill out the top, you have your buyers, you have your client, I just have them, like when it's a buyer, you just have, so this is Bright's version of covering their ass, excuse my language, to say that they've notified all consumers of what the changes are. So everybody has their form, like this is PAR form of the summary of changes, this is Bright's form of the summary of changes. The reason we need to fill this out is you can be fined by Bright if they do an audit and say, hey, Will, send me your form for this sale that you just had after the changes went through. So you'd have to produce this to Bright perhaps. It's almost like how the state doesn't ask us to send our transcripts in anymore, but if we're audited, we better be able to show transcripts. Same thing with Bright. If you're audited, you need to show this form. So buyers usually, and here's the thing, I'm a stickler for detail. I always have people sign and date everything. Like there's no signature on here for your client. It's just initials. That initials, the marks of an initial are pretty vague. So I just have my clients sign and date here. I have my seller, if they're wanted on the internet, sign and date there, and then I have them sign and date on the bottom. So I'm totally covered if Bright ever calls me about this form. But the lower part, sellers have to have this and this, buyers have this. I just have them tell me, do they want their house on the internet? Are we doing it coming soon? And when does it go effective for everyone to see it? So this is pretty much common sense of how Bright worked before, except coming soon was changed to even be longer, which is even, I think, worse. Like you can have a coming soon for up to, yeah. It's basically unlimited, which is silly. So that if you think of it that way, you have the consumer notice, you have the PAR form, and you have your Bright form. Get those three out of the way right away with all clients. Any questions on that one?
When the 2024 notice, how long are we gonna be using that?
This one or?
No,
This one, I don't know. I guess it's up to each brokerage. Like right now, our brokerage requires this in command for all of our transactions. So it's up to the brokers. There's no right or wrong.
Okay.
So whenever you think that, everybody's on board with it.
The fee comes in.
Yeah, the state's not gonna require that. The state's only gonna require still your consumer notice.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you think about it.
And then.
Bright's gonna require this. So as a brokerage, you probably want that.
So I've been translating this myself last month or so, but I mean, all our clients have to sign the very top section. And the bottom section is for sellers, that way.
Yes, yeah.
Buyers and.
Well, no. The top section is just for buyers and sellers. The bottom section is for sellers.
Yes, that's the way I.
So what's your best practice? Like, if we just want to like tell people where to sign exactly, like.
I just have where it says clients to initial and acknowledge they understood the above. I have them sign there.
What the bottom section though?
I have them sign down here and I have them initial what they want us to do. Is it going on the internet? Is it in-house only? So I have them initial and still sign the bottom.
Well, most of them are,
Yeah.
it's all going to be the top one then.
Yes, all gonna be the top.
99% of the time it's going to be the top one. I mean, we're always putting it in the MLS. So it's never
Well,
going to be.
in the brokerage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people don't want their house to be viewed by many people. There's still people that like, I'm nervous if people come in my home and yeah, we still get requests that it can only be shared, it can't be publicly marketed on the internet. So some people don't want their house on the internet. They don't want photos on the internet. So this gives your consumer a lot of options. I agree with you. 99% of the time, they want it on the internet. They want the broadest distribution of the property so that it's marketed the broadest way and they can get the most offers. But there are people that still select this, especially with coming soon.
So the third one down for coming soon.
Yes. So 2C is coming soon.
With the date, it's going live.
Yeah, it will begin, ready for showings on that date. The other thing, before we go any further, I just wanted you to know, PAR, when they rolled out all the new forms, did put a comprehensive guide together, a training guide. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but every one of you have the access to PAR forms online. I would say with 99% of PAR forms, when you go in to download the form, there's a guide to complete the form. And it's almost like, and I'm not saying any of us are dummies, but it's like the dummy's guide to the agreement of sale. It goes through every paragraph and tells you how to fill out the contract. Like for new agents, and the agreement of sale is what, 14 pages? The guide to complete the agreement of sale is like 50 pages. It has great practice tips. For example, when you type in a name, when you're typing in your client's names, a practice tip is use all capital letters, because capital letters can't be mistaken like lowercase letters. Like, was it a J or an L? A J, capital J is different than a capital L, right? But lowercase, you know, if they do a lowercase j and don't put the hook and they put the dot above it, it could be an I. Is it an I or a J? You know what I'm saying? So deeds are prepared often from the agreement of sale. So I always put my buyers and sellers' names on the listing and sales contract in all capital letters. That's just one practice tip. That guide for the agreement of sale is chock full of practice tips on how to. Here's the thing. I always teach from a standpoint of risk management, lowering your risk, because when there's a lawsuit, attorneys do a broad sweep. They bring in everybody involved. They bring in the seller's agent, the buyer's agent, the broker. And why? Because they think we have deep pockets and we carry errors and omissions insurance. But in some instances, and you can check with Will or Ryan, our E&O doesn't cover certain claims. We're going to talk about dual agency in a minute. If you're in a dual agency situation, errors and omissions may not cover you. So we're going to talk about that when we get into the buyer's agency agreement. So again, that was just a tip. The other tip I'm going to give that I always give in every class, if you're not signed up for PAR Just Listed, you need to do that today. Go on PAR's website and sign up for their daily blog. It's called Just Listed. That is the only way you are going to keep in touch and on top of the changes that are happening with forms and everything else. PAR has no way to communicate with all of you except through that daily email. And when these changes were going on, they were emailing daily about that. I mean, you see it every day, I'm sure.
Yeah, I do. You and I talked about it a couple of times.
Yeah, so every agent should be on PAR's site and requesting they get their daily blog. It's called Just Listed. That's the only way you're going to keep in touch with stuff. So we did 3 forms. We're not going to go over the consumer notice. If you're sitting in this room and don't know how to do the consumer notice, there's a shredder over there. Put your license in it on the way out the door. Do Ryan and Bill a favor and shred your license.
Question about the policy form.
Okay.
I thought we only needed that if you weren't using the new contracts yet.
Well, it would be if you had an existing listing that covered you to show the compensation, because you're telling the seller on the old contract you'll cover the compensation, but that was the purpose of it. But I think what happened was people then decided to use this as an easy way to go over the summary of all the changes. And that sellers really don't have to pay a buyer's agent if they don't want to. Like, you can get into a lot of dialogue because a lot of sellers agents were saying to us that sellers were saying, oh, we understand we don't have to pay a buyer's agent anymore. That's how the average seller interpreted it here. Right, that's what they heard. So this was designed to kind of talk, it doesn't really get into that they don't have to pay because we didn't want to say that. So it just covered that seller concessions can be concessions towards buyer's fees. And maybe it's, I think when we get into the agreement of sale, it'll be a little bit clearer. But I almost want to jump to your buyer's agency agreement first, if that's okay. Because when you first sit down with a buyer, that's the form you're going to go over with them, right? Did we put the buyer's agency in here? Oh, sorry. Another document. Yeah, she could just add the buyer's agency contract where you want it. She could throw it at the beginning and I'll just talk about it. So you're sitting down with your buyer's agent. What does a buyer's agency contract do? Just throw out answer. What's your buyer's agency contract do? What's the purpose of it?
Fiduciary relationship.
Fiduciary responsibility to the buyer.
Business relationship.
Business relationship as what?
Exclusive buyer's agency.
Okay, what else?
Spells out costs.
Costs, what else? What about
Term.
right, like how long? Right. Your old buyer's agency and your new buyer's agency have always said one thing. You're hiring me and you are responsible to pay my fee. It always said that. It says it today. Before it said, and it says today, however, our policy is that if a broker is willing to cooperate, we'll accept cooperating compensation from another broker. But if they're not, you're hiring me and you have to pay me. So with that said, I think one of the huge changes, practice changes that we all should be doing is when you fill out your buyer's cost estimate, we're gonna call it the BEC, buyer's estimated closing cost. Down at the bottom, if you're using Bright, one of the things that you should start adding to your buyer's cost sheet is broker fee. So if your buyer's agency contract said that you get paid 10% plus, let's say $600. So it says you pay me a 10% fee plus a flat $600. And you just sold your buyer a $300,000 house. What's your commission? 30,600. There should be a line on your buyer's agency cost sheet, your buyer's estimated cost sheet of what your fee is. That's the cost for them to buy a house. Now, you have a second line on there that says, you can say co-op compensation or seller concession, whatever. And that could be shown as a negative number. Because let's say your seller was willing to give 7.5%. Let's just do 7 to make the numbers easy. Now you got 21,000 of the 30,600 from your seller in the transaction. So your buyer's left with giving you. The buyer has to come up with $8,400 out of their pocket to pay you. Or you can go back to your buyer's agency contract and change this to 7, and you both have to initial and date the change to that contract. That's up to you as a business person. But do you agree that your fee is a buyer's cost?
Yes.
And do you agree that if you cooperated or got concessions through the agreement of sale, if there was nothing being offered and you were able to negotiate concessions, that that's a credit to your buyer? How many of you are doing this? Everybody should be doing it. This is a hard, I'll be honest with you, I've been doing this for 31 years. And it took me a lot, I had to write notes on every buyer file. I would just write in big letters, BEC change, add lines. So that I would remember to do this, because this isn't customary for us to do. Really, we should have always been doing it. Our fee was always the buyers. So basically, before we would have just shown here, if we were getting 10%, you'd show the amount as a positive, you'd show it as a negative, the net result for the buyer was 0. So it didn't really cost them any money necessarily to use us, but we should really be thinking about showing our buyers the fee and talking to them at closing. Because what if their dream house is owned by a hard-ass seller that's not willing to pay you a penny? When you're talking to them, if they can afford it, if they have to pay you, that house may not be affordable to them anymore. And you're wasting your time showing it to them, because where's the money going to come from if you can't negotiate it from the seller? Is everybody following me? We just have to think a little bit more. None of this is hard. None of this is new. It's just how you think about what we're doing. So if you look at your buyer's agency contract, here's where it says, do they have an agreement with another broker? Yes or no? And if they do, you have to explain that yes, and it expires or whatever, I mean, if they do, I don't know why you'd go any further. You'd have to figure out if they can be released from that. Like, why would you take that on? Okay,
A number of investors will do that. I work with some investors that work with other.
then you would
agents.
have a non-exclusive buyer's agency agreement with them that covers you for the properties you show them. You wouldn't get into an exclusive. buyer's agency. Okay. Look at 2B, broker's fee paid by whom? To whom? The buyer is hiring you and the buyer is paying you. And in a purchase where a seller is represented by a real estate broker, the fee is one thing. This means if this is where you can do the for sale by owner. So if they're not represented by a real estate broker, this is your FSBO. You may want more if you're gonna work with a FSBO, because now you're doing both sides of the transaction. So A, you can have a fee if they're so if Will listed a house and I have the buyer and I'm showing Will's listing. That's a house listed by a real estate broker. My fee is 10%. But if they're not listed by a real estate broker, I need 12.5% because I'm gonna be doing two sides of a transaction and I'm gonna be doing more work. And that's fine. You can split it that way. You can get an advanced retainer from them. We had to think outside of the box when we did this because the committee said, now that buyer's agents are free to enter into agreements with buyers, some brokerage somewhere will come up with flat fees. We'll work with every buyer out there for just a flat fee. Or we charge by the hour, like a lawyer. We have an advanced retainer and you only pay me by the hour I work for you. So if you wanted to do that, you'd have to figure out how to calculate it, how to bill them. But this was designed to be traditional, the way we've always done it, with a percentage amount, and then if you collect an extra dollar amount as a broker fee, that's all spelled out here. And it says right here in 2B4, broker will not retain any amount greater than the broker fees agreed, regardless of the source, regardless of who it's coming from. So that's the change, that you cannot collect more than what you put on here. Is everybody good there? Are you setting up your buyer's agency agreements correctly with what you want to be paid? So
I have a question.
okay, go
Now,
ahead.
I have some clients and it just happened last week. I showed them 3 properties in one day. The one property, they were offering 3%.
Okay,
So we signed a buyer's agreement for that. The other 2 properties were offering 2.5%.
okay. So if you signed a 3% and they bought the 2.5%, your fee is 3% here, the 2.5 goes here, and they're gonna owe you 0.5%, unless you go back and change this 3% to 2.5, and you both initial and date the change to the contract.
Okay. Okay,
Because they are
yeah.
under contract with
For
you
3%.
to pay you
Yeah.
3%.
Yep.
And you have every right to collect it, and you have a responsibility to let them know that they owe it to you
Mhm.
and that you're not getting that covered by, because remember, the consuming public of buyers is not used to paying their agents. Right? And if you put zeros in here and your shtick is, work with me, you don't have to pay me, I get paid from the seller, and the seller doesn't want to pay you, you deserve and will get 0. I have no compassion when we get these forms and they're filled out with 0. You're an idiot. I'm sorry. You're working for nothing. Why would you do that? You could have your feet up, drinking a beer, having a glass of wine, reading a book. Why would you show houses for 0 just to get a buyer to work with you? You have value. You have a license. It took education to get that license. Respect yourself. Don't work for nothing. And if you do, you get nothing. It's that simple. But in your case, you'd have to show them on paper. The other thing about this form is that I see agents, I'm getting into more than you probably bargained for today, but the other thing about this form, agents have their buyers sign the lender's cost sheet. If you're audited by the state, and the only cost sheet in the file is the lender's, you could lose your license. You are responsible by state law to provide the buyer with a cost sheet. So what do? You get the lender's cost sheet. So when you're filling out the one in Bright or whatever form, PAR has one, you're putting the lender fees in that you know that they are from the lender, like what the underwriting is, what the appraisal is, what the doc prep is, any other lender fees. You're using the lender's cost sheet to get their fees, then you're putting in your fees, but it has to be the cost sheet that you prepared for them. A buyer can sign, I have my buyers sign both. But if the state audits you, it has to be your version of the cost sheet they're looking for, not the lender's. That doesn't count as meeting the requirement that the agent provided them with a cost sheet. You didn't, the lender did. That, everybody good there? Okay. The other thing I want to point out about this agreement, and we're gonna do just a 5-minute agency role play here, okay? Because I want you to look at the last page of this. So I sit down with a buyer, they call me, Gary, we were referred from you from Sally and Joe. You helped them buy their house, they were happy with you, okay, I bring them in the office, we sit down, we sign a buyer's agency agreement. What am I? What agency role am I? If I just signed a buyer's agency agreement with the buyer. I'm an exclusive buyer's agent, or I'm a buyer's agent, right? Right, exclusive because I only will work with somebody who wants to work with me. 2 days earlier, what's your name?
Belinda.
Belinda? Belinda. I go to Belinda's house because she wants to list her house with me. I signed a listing contract. What am I? Listing agent, seller's agent. Seller's agent, buyer's agent. Okay, you're not a listing agent, you're a seller's agent. It's the person you represent. You're the seller's agent. Now, my buyers have been looking for houses for 3 weeks and they notice Belinda's listing. And now under Pennsylvania legal theory, if my buyers buy Belinda's house, what am I? Dual agent. Let me ask you some questions. When I signed up with, so if I'm a dual agent, what's my responsibility?
Belinda.
I'm a scale of justice. If I tip to Belinda, I've harmed the buyer. If I tip to the buyer, I've harmed Belinda. So if Belinda says, list my house for 100,000, but I'll take 95, and the buyers say she's offering her house at 100, but we want to pay 95, what do? I get my buyer's offer, I present it to her. So they offered 95. She said, you know, do you think I should counter? I don't know. Do you think I should offer more? I don't know. What am I? I'm useless as tits on a bull. You're useless as a dual agent. So in that situation, dual agency existed because I had an agreement with the buyer and I had an agreement with Belinda. So it existed. If I have Belinda's house listed and I get a phone call, under the new laws, I can show my listing to a buyer as long as I let that buyer know I represent the seller. You are, first of all, I get that phone call? Are you working with anybody? Yeah, I'm working with Will. Call Will and have him show you the house. Well, he's out of town. Well, because it's Will, I would show his buyer the house and answer their questions, but I would say, you gotta go back to Will and get Will to write the offer. Or I would call him and say, look, I just showed your clients the house, because I'm helping my seller. I just showed your clients the house. They had some questions. Here's what I told them. I think they're interested. Please follow up with them. So I'm not breaking the new NAR, the new Department of Justice rules because I showed a house without a buyer's agency contract. But if I continue to show them houses because they didn't sign up with Will, and I'm one of those agents that would still a buyer, which I wouldn't do, I can't show them the house 2 doors down without a buyer's agency agreement. So if you get a lead off of your listing and continue to work with them, you can only show them your listing as a seller's agent without representing them. And you have to let them know before they walk through the door, they are unrepresented at that point if they don't have a buyer's agency agreement with somebody else. They're unrepresented. The point I want to make to you is, If I sign up that buyer, let's forget about Will, they weren't Will's buyers, they're just buyers on the street. They wanna buy the house, they wanna buy my listing. If I sign them up, I've just created dual agency. It was never designed to be created. Do you think when I did my listing spiel to Belinda and told her how wonderful I am and how I'm gonna help her negotiate, that now she's gonna say, okay, I understand you're just greedy and want all the money, and now you can't do squat for me. So you can't help me negotiate because now you've created dual agency and you'll harm the buyer. So here, through all of that, here's the tip, the practice tip I want to give you. On your listing contract that's in your packet and on your buyer's agency contract, there's a special clause on both. So what's your buyer's agency contract? That's your employment agreement with the buyer. What's your listing contract? That's your employment agreement with the seller. They're employing you. If you add to both of those employment contracts, the single agency addendum, it clearly states that you do not practice dual agency and you are you're their represented agent. So the single agency form is in here. So both contracts have that. And the single agency addendum clearly states, it's in your packet too. So I want you to pull out the listing contract and the agreement of sale and find that clause in both of them. And then pull out your single agency addendum, it's right behind the listing contract. And I always check the first block that says broker does not represent buyers and sellers in the same transaction. It's most important when you're dealing with your buyer's agency contract to tell them you always represent the seller. So if your buyer wants to look at your listing, it says if the buyer chooses to buy a property listed by the broker will immediately tell the buyer, and the buyer's agency contract will end in regard to that property only. Broker only represents buyers and sellers in the same transaction when separate designated agents are working with the buyer and the seller. Broker does not allow the same agent to represent both buyers and sellers in the same transaction. So if my buyer wants to buy my listing, I have single agency addendums attached to that buyer's contract and to the listing contract. So my buyer was informed when I sat down with them, if later on I list a house and you want to buy it, my broker will designate, what's your name? Philip, to show you my listing. Now, between Philip and I'm gonna do a referral fee. Which is totally legal. Buyers and sellers don't need to know about that necessarily. But I'm referring the client, so I lose that client, my broker's in charge, your broker owns your agreements. Broker Will said, Gary, your buyers want to buy your listing. I'm designating Philip as the designated buyer's agent. You're the designated seller's agent. And in this situation, what's the broker? The dual agent. So use the single agency addendum on all your contracts, sell your own listings, make all the money to a non-represented buyer. And that's why I asked Will and Ryan to put this form in there. It is so simple. So the sign call on Belinda's house. You want to buy Belinda's house. They bought 50 houses in their life. They don't need an agent. They're hoping that if they use the listing agent to buy the house, I'm going to work with her and cut my commission and they'll get a piece of that savings. That's what their thought is, the consuming public. So I showed the house to these buyers from the sign. I told them before we walked through the door, I will be happy to show you the house, but I want you to know I represent the seller only. I do not practice dual agency. So if you would want to make an offer on the house, you would be an unrepresented buyer. That's fine. You understand that. Show us the house. I show them the house. They want to buy it. When we sit down to sign the contract, I go over the consumer notice with them. I circle that I'm the seller's agent. This form says buyer has received a consumer notice. They have no relationship with another broker. The buyer is not represented by the above selling agent who is working exclusively for the seller in the seller's best interest. So you're totally covered. You get 100% of your listing commission all in your pocket. You've sold it to a non-represented buyer who's informed they're non-represented. In the agreement of sale where you check your relationship, you check no relationship with that buyer. And everything was done legally. And most importantly, you did not create dual agency. Does all that make sense? I know that was a lot, and it has nothing to do with the changes, but this is what's happening, I think, because it does have to do with the changes, because you can show your own listings without a buyer's agency contract, but you can't be out there showing houses without signed buyer's agency contracts. And trust me, it's not the state, it's the Department of Justice who's going to send out the testers. The Department of Justice is still not satisfied with the settlement agreement. They want more. They said, we're circumventing it, we're lying to the clients, we're still making the seller pay the fee for the buyer's agents. They're not done with us, and they're not gonna let go. So there will be testers out there testing you from the federal level, the DOJ level. They're looking, they before this went final, they requested all of California's forms. And reviewed California's forms. When we were doing our forms, we had a broker that was a licensed broker in Delaware. Delaware eliminated operating compensation altogether. All that Delaware offers is concessions. The seller gives a concession and you can apply it toward the broker fee or seller's closing costs, whatever. Here's a lump sum of money. Mr. Buyer, you figure out what you want to do with it. We're not offering co-broke compensation at all. And that's really what DOJ is after, is eliminating operating compensation. But the agreement, the settlement agreement says we can still do it. We just can't communicate it in the multi-list.
Question, so you have broker, then you have teams. I personally sometimes feel like, two team agents are working a deal together. It's kind of, to me, it always seems like a gray line between dual agency and not dual agency.
That's dual agency.
So
There's
you
no way
you
around
consider
it.
that, you consider that,
It's dual agent.
consider.
Yeah.
Dual.
Well, if they're designated, the broker can designate one to the buyer and one to the seller, but if the team concept is. All of the members of the team are your listing agent, and all of the members of the team are buyer's agents, because they can interchange, then. If you're practicing designated agency. You can sell a house, if I listed a house and we both work for Will, you're a designated buyer's agent and I'm a designated seller's agent, and we're fine. But if all team members represent all clients, both listing and sellers and buyers, that would get hairy.
But I mean, there's nothing on the
If
form
you
that
sell
says that.
Belinda's listing to your buyer, you're a designated agent, you're a designated buyer's agent, she's a designated seller's agent, and it's kosher.
The broker's a dual agent.
And the broker's the dual agent. He's making sure that the file's protected, that personal information about the seller and personal information about the buyer isn't shared with you two.
What Phil's saying is like he has the Accorder team, so if his mom's the list agent and then Phil, who is on the team, is the buyer's agent, that's a dual agency because they're on the same team, correct?
No, it's up to the broker, because the state doesn't recognize teams.
Okay.
There are two agents in your brokerage. Broker needs to, I hate saying that because you're the broker, but the broker needs to say, Phil, you're the buyer. Now, I would put somewhere in the contract that your buyer knows, you don't have to, but your mother's the listing agent and you're the selling agent. So where's your loyalty gonna go? You shouldn't sell your mother's listing, because there's the potential for the buyer to say, are you loyal to me or are you loyal to your mother?
That's a conflict of interest.
It's a conflict of interest that I wouldn't go down that path. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
but there's companies out there that their model is all of our agents represent all of our customers. They're small, like mom and pop brokerages. They have 4 agents. Every agent represents every customer, buyer and seller. That's a complete dual agency office, which is I don't know why they do it, but they're out there and they're practicing today.
Can I ask you a real application? So
Sure.
if I am going to write an offer with Payola, we are both individual agents and we both are at Keller Williams. Do we elect dual agent on the broker side?
Yeah, the broker's the dual agent, that's correct. You're designated seller and you're designated buyer. And on page 1 of that agreement of sale. Let's stick with the agreement of sale. Does everybody understand the single agency option at the bottom of your listing and in buyer's agency contracts? Now. I don't want to put Will on the spot, but that would be up to him if he wants you to practice as single. It protects you liability wise tremendously. Tremendously. Because it's easy for buyers to understand. You say to them, look, I'm not going to be a dual agent. Because when I took that listing, I promised that seller, I'm going to represent you. Do you think that seller would say, oh, you know what? Yeah, you don't need to represent me. And think about it. When you're working with someone, whether they understand dual agency or not, don't they think that you have their best interests? That's common sense. If someone builds a relationship with you, they're building it on trust and your experience, and they think you represent them. Whether you've told them 1,000 times you don't, that you're a dual agent, it doesn't matter. The minute they feel the scale went 1/10 of a degree, one way or the other, and you're sued for undisclosed dual agency, you won't win. You won't win that lawsuit, trust me. You will not win. So why get involved in that at all? Be a single agent, sell your own listings to non-represented buyers, collect all the money, and you did it. You've done that 100% correctly.
Who helps to make the offer to a non-represented buyer? Like,
You still have to, you owe them the duties on the back of the consumer notice. The 10 bullets on the back of the consumer notice. You still have to write the offer for the non-represented buyer. You still have to help them through the process. You have to make sure they're knowledgeable of what's going on. You simply can't help them negotiate price up front, and you can't help them negotiate after inspections. But you have to say to them, okay, you had the home inspection, the termite, the radon. Now what would you like? How do you want to reply to the seller? Well, I want the seller to fix A, B, and C. So you write that up. But you don't tell them what to ask for the seller. You ask them, what do you want the seller to do? You're responsible to document that and present it to your seller. Now, between you and your seller, you can say, if I were you, I would do A and B and give them $1,000 and call it a day. Then you present the seller's counter back to the buyer, but you can't help that buyer write their own counter. So this is what the seller's willing to do. Are you okay with that? No. We don't want 1,000, we want 2,000, and you bring it back to the seller. They want 2,000, you wanted to give them 1,000. Let's split the difference, middle of the road. You go back to the buyer. They'll do 1,500 to meet in the middle. Okay, that's fine. Then you document it. So you're still responsible to document everything for that buyer, write their offer for them. Remember, you're getting all the commission. You have to do documentation preparation services for them, guide them through the real estate rules. You still have those duties on the back of the consumer notice. You owe those to any real estate consumer, whether they're your client or not. And those say you'll do offer preparation, keep them informed of what's going on, let them know if you have a fiduciary relationship with the title company or service they're using. So those 10 commandments on the back of the consumer notice, you owe to every consumer.
so, well, that still assists you with your seller, right?
Right,
Because you're getting all that information.
right. So did that answer your question with checking the blocks? I'm just going back to the sales agreement quickly so you can see where you.
Left side, yes, I got that. How about the right side for the licensee?
So first of all, if you're selling your own listing to a buyer that's not represented, you check no business relationship because you have no business relationship with that buyer. So when you're selling your own listing to a non-represented buyer, you check this. When you're in-house, they have a business relation with Keller Williams Keystone, broker's a dual. Listing agent is a buyer's agent is a buyer's agent, designated agency. Seller's agent is a seller with designated seller's agency. So if you're in-house, you're checking the second block for buyer and seller. It's clearly stated here, all company licensees represent the buyer. Do all of your buyers belong to him? Yeah. you're always gonna be a designated agent. Even when designated agency just isn't in-house, it's cooperatively too. Like when I'm the seller's agent and a buyer submits an offer, they check seller's agent at the top. They don't know, our company does not, all of the licensees in our company don't represent myself. I'm always the seller's, the designated seller's agent. If you're unsure what to put for the other company, one, pick up the phone and call. That's foreign to us anymore, picking up the phone and calling an agent. Call and ask them what they are, or leave it blank, and when they check it, your buyer doesn't have to initial this, because there's some changes on here that if it makes things more clear. Jim Goldsmith has told me, if anything changes that would affect either side, it has to be initial and dated. The best thing to do is initial and date any changes, but if you're just striking off this and checking this, the buyer doesn't necessarily have to sign that change to have a fully executed agreement. Because it didn't harm either party by making something more clear. Does that help you?
Yep.
Okay. Then this is where it comes in, the changes. So I was talking to Will about this yesterday, so you can't tell people on the multi-list what you're willing to pay them. So if I took Belinda's listing and Belinda agreed to pay a 10% commission, and I told her I'm gonna split that 5 and 5, and you're showing my listing, I can't put it in the multi-list that I'm giving you 5%. So what I do, the minute I get the showing time request on my phone, I push your number and I call and I say, what's your name?
Jared.
Jared, I see you're showing 123 Main Street, we're offering a 5% co-broke. That took me 15 seconds to do. And if I don't get them, I leave a message, because I'm allowed to leave my cooperating compensation on a voicemail. I just can't put it in the multi-list. And I can't put it anywhere in the multi-list. So a team in our company got fined $1,000 because they put in agent remarks. Go to this website to see our commissions on our listings. Well, you idiot, you used the multi-list to steer somebody to your commission chart. Like, duh. You can't put it in showing time. Now, if you've opened showing time, you get a notice. How many times you have to click out of that notice? That's getting annoying too. So they're all reminding you, you can't, so you pick up the phone and you call. If you don't like to talk to people, again, the shredder's over there, text them and say, Jared, co-broke on that is $5,000 or 5%, or seller concessions on that property is $10,000. I can give you a dollar amount or a percentage, and then you figure out how you want to use those concessions to apply to your buyer's fees. So all that's fine, that's what you would want to do. It's okay to send over the co-op broker form with the offer. You don't have to have that signed before you write the offer. If I told you 5% and you're writing on my property, send your co-broke form over with your offer. You don't have to send it ahead of time. I'm not committing that I'm paying you until I see what your offer is. Why would I do that? You don't have to have that signed ahead of time. Some listing agents are leaving co-op broker forms in the house signed by them that when you show the listing, you can grab it. They're saying we're offering you 5% and they have a stack of them in the listing. I guess that's okay too. You're not advertising your commission on anything but a counter, and that's fine. I'm not sure that, so that's another legal way to do it.
I like that way, personally.
Yeah, and you can do that. So you're not in violation of Article 16 of the Code of Ethics that says you can't negotiate your commission as part of the agreement of sale if you're sending over a co-broke form with your offer with the amount I told you. It can be at the same time. A listing agent has no right to ask you, nor do you as a listing agent. When you're a listing agent, you have no right to ask the buyer to see their buyer's agency agreement. You're not the police. So if you think the buyer's agent is screwing you because they only have 2.5 on their buyer's agent, they only have 5 on their buyer's agency agreement, and you're paying them 10, and you're worried they're going to keep 10, it's none of your business. They violated the law, not you. You cannot ask somebody A buyer's agent can't ask for the listing contract and a listing agent can't ask for the buyer's agent contract. That's between you and the buyer and you and the seller. So if you're asked to produce your buyer's agency agreement by a listing agent, you don't have to do that. That's not for them to worry about. You're the one breaking the law if you take more than your buyer's agency agreement says. Don't be the police, just focus on what you're doing and do it the right way. You don't have to police other agents.
So, well, I'm still confused by this too, like, it's actually the law, like legal, like written somewhere in some government book, however they do laws. Like, or is it a policy? Or like,
No, it was an agreement that NAR made with the Department of Justice.
yeah,
So that it's a court order. So you break the state law by not having a buyer's agency agreement that you did.
Yeah.
You're gonna get slapped and you're gonna pay $500. This is a court order, a federal court order that the Department of Justice placed on NAR. If you violate a court order, you're going to jail.
yeah.
So it's a court order that was agreed upon, a settlement agreement. And you violated it. You're in violation of what you committed that you would do moving forward. So fines, jail time, it can be, the sky's the limit. And the DOJ is not gonna have tolerance. So
Was it-
what
was
are
it-
you worried about breaking? What law are you worried about
No,
breaking?
it's just confusing to me.
It's a court order
Never
forever. It's
So you can't say it's the law, it's the court, NAR, the Department of Justice said, we're suing you, NAR, for antitrust violations. And NAR looked at it and felt that if we lose, it could cost us billions of dollars. If we settle, then when we agree to the terms of the settlement, it's only gonna cost us $400,000. Or what was it? Or $400 million, yeah, I was gonna say 400,000 was nothing, $400 million, and we pay it over 4 or 5 years.
So before this, though, like, what other things could we go to jail for in real estate? I mean, I feel like I've never thought I could go.
Well, you can hardly, well, you used to do extreme fraud or misrepresentation, extreme, that you harmed somebody or someone died, maybe.
Because this is like it's like a new concept. I feel like.
It is, the penalties are much more severe because it's a court order versus just the
Commission regulation.
commission regulations, right? So your license is based on the RELRA, Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act. It used to be the Green Book. That's for the old people. We had the Green Book we got at school. Now it's online. So it says, yeah, I still have mine too. And it's full of little yellow stickies of where, so that says you have to give somebody a consumer notice. So if the state comes in and Philip, you didn't have a consumer notice in your file, you're gonna get a fine because you violated the licensing act. You broke the licensing act. You're not going to jail for that.
Yeah.
But now you're a member of NAR and NAR, it's just like, and maybe this is a bad example. If you were in a bitter divorce and you have child custody and you kept your kid longer than you were supposed to, and the other person said he violated the custody agreement, you keep violating that custody agreement, I'm sure if your wife had a Barracuda lawyer, you could go to jail for breaking your custody agreement. I mean, so this is an agreement made with NAR and the Department of Justice that we all will do business this way. We promise you. And if we don't, you violated a court order. So you could go online and Google, what are the penalties for violating a federal court order? And that would be your answer.
There's been no federal court orders in our industry until this moment.
Not that I'm aware of.
No, it's fair housing stuff, but that's totally different than.
Yeah, that's totally different than what we're talking about here. Yeah. Fair housing. Fair housing would be significant fines.
Something you don't want to.
Right, and that could end up with jail time too.
Yeah.
To protect you with, and see, that's why using PAR forms is so important. Like, for example, to protect you from violating fair housing, we removed the buyer's name from the multiple offer summary worksheet. I don't know if many of you know that. It's not on there anymore. We just have the agent name. And even with agent name, I just put the initials, so my seller has no idea that the agent is white, black, Nepali, Hispanic, whatever. The seller needs to look at an offer based on the contents of the offer and what the financial impacts are to them. They do not look at the people. You should never, as a seller's agent, provide your seller with a love letter. You're giving them the power to break fair housing laws. So I talked to Jim Goldsmith about that. And he said, well, you're right in your actions. You're withholding something you got with an offer. Because it could, so if two lesbians wanted to buy the house and a family with 3 kids and a dog wanted to buy the house, and your seller's an evangelical grandmother who believes that homosexuals are evil, and she picks the family, she's broken fair housing laws because same sex is protected class. And you gave her, you the agent gave her that letter, which led her to take the family offer over the lesbians offer, and the lesbians were higher and cleaner and better. But a letter persuaded her to take the family offer. You're getting involved in a fair housing case. So Jim told me technically you have to provide your seller with everything the buyer's agent gave you. You withheld a letter for a good reason. So now my listing contract clearly states in the other section, instructions, my seller instructs me that if I receive any sort of letter or photographs of the buyer or from the buyer, I am not to present that to them. So I have instruction written in my listing contract, and then I put in agent remarks, do not, and sometimes I forget to put in agent remarks, do not submit love letters with your offer. And when I get them, I just call the agent right away and say, total transparency, I have it in writing for my seller, your love letter is not getting to them. Just so you know, we're gonna base it on the terms of your offer, not the people. Because we too often think we know who should be in a house. When you write a description, so you have a $3 million house, and you start the description with executive style home. Well, Ryan or Philip, you go to a diner every morning and your server Sally pours your coffee. She's behind the counter. She makes $2.50 an hour in tips. Can she afford a $3 million home on her server job?
Assume no.
You'd assume no. But today she says to you, hey, Philip, aren't you in real estate? Yeah, I am. Well, my husband and I just won the Powerball last night for $7 million. And there's a house up on the hill that's $3.5 million. Can you show me that house?
Like,
Happy to. Is Sally an executive?
You wanna go right now? No.
Is Sally an executive? Can Sally afford the house? Absolutely. Describe the house, not the people that can live there. You don't know if it's perfect for an empty nester. If a family of 6 wants to live there, they can. Describe the property and the property's attributes. Now, right, Zillow, they're all scanning your comments for violations, words that could be in violation.
Can we go back to Phil's question about the law versus the court
Law.
order? So if that's because we're members of NAR. So
Yeah.
if NAR goes away, then the judgment goes away too. Is that correct?
Well,
Or if we go away from NAR, or
I don't know how that would work because the court order is against NAR. There are some brokers who are holding out and saying they're not opted out. They've opted out.
so that's
of the
why it's
law.
not a law.
Right.
That's why.
So you're
Rather-
participating, you either participate or you say you're against it, and then I'm assuming the Justice Department could go against the companies.
I think those things are still pending.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing
Okay.
is November is the hearing for the final. Like, we had to be compliant by, what was it, August 17th, yeah. The final hearing to determine the lawsuit isn't until November, so I hate to tell you this, but this could all change again. We have to be compliant now because the court order said by the 17th.
And that, I hate to like keep going down these rabbit holes. It's so confusing. And it's, commercial is different though. Lots of them, a lot of commercial.
Yeah, we had commercial agents on this task force and they were bored out of their mind because they said, we always negotiated commission. And I have never done commercial, so I'm gonna default to. Oh, you don't do any commercial?
So,
Did you ever do commercial?
Just a lease here.
So like, commercial has never, your commission payment as a buyer's agent on a commercial property was always negotiated as part of the deal.
I thought it was always like, I thought a lot of this applied to MLS listings. And like, but if it's not in the MLS, like off market, or like, investor, commercial, industrial. You
It
know,
boils down to a tiny little small factor that we forced agents to put a percent in there. If we would have allowed the buyer's agent's commission, BAC, to be 0, but because we said it has to be a number, the Department of Justice said that's forcing your seller to pay a buyer's agent, and that's antitrust. You didn't give your seller option. And had we made it optional, we probably, they still would have come after us, but it would have been a little lighter. That's where we couldn't say it was a mandated, it was something that was mandated, and then NAR writes MLS policy. So that's where they got themselves into a little bit of a bind.
I think that a distinction between residential and commercial is many commercial agents are not licensed because business people are assumed to know what they're doing. So we're licensed because we're protecting consumers. So it doesn't apply if they're not licensed.
Yeah. So the second part of the agreement of sale that I really want to talk about is that everybody is confused about is the second page. If you're selling my listing and I called you and told you I'm paying you 5% and your buyer's agency agreement says you can be paid 5% and you send a co-broke over and you're not asking the seller to pay any buyer's closing costs, you leave it all blank. This was designed to allow so follow this example. Your buyer's agency agreement says you can collect 5. I call you and say, I'm only giving you 4. You show your buyer that you need 5, I'm giving you 4, there's $1,000 different. It's $100,000 house. They owe you 5, the seller's willing to come up with 4 of that, they owe you 1,000. The buyer says to you, Philip, I can't afford that 1,000. You got to negotiate that for me as part of my agreement of sale. So in the agreement of sale, it says, in addition to any cooperating compensation negotiated between the brokers using the co-op broker form or some other agreement, seller will pay a fee to the broker for the buyer on behalf of the buyer at settlement of $1,000. So your buyer can negotiate with the seller to pay you any difference that you're not making if they can't afford to pay you. So 3A, I would write in there, this is the gap between what the seller is willing to pay and what my buyer's agency agreement says, period. If your buyer wants you to negotiate that with the seller at the time they present an offer, it goes in 3A. Now, in addition to your buyer not being able to pay you your commission, their VA and need $3,000 additional assistance towards closing costs. Philip, ask the seller for that too. So then you're going to put closing cost assistance of $3,000 here. This is your old seller assist. If the seller's only offering seller's assist in total, if I say I'm only giving $10,000 to you, you can put it all here because on your cost sheet, you showed them your fee, then the negative number is going to be the 10,000. And if there's any left so if your fee was only 8,000 and I'm giving 10, now that was $2,000 less that they have to bring in their own closing cost money. So you show the 8 negative of a 10, now that's 2,000 less that can apply to their other costs, their lender fees, their escrows, whatever. So this really shouldn't be that complicated. You don't have to put the number here that's on the CBC. The CBC covered that already. This is only for if you need more than what's on the CBC. and your buyer can't pay you the difference, and your buyer instructed you to ask the seller to negotiate the difference between what your CBC is. So if your CBC is 5 and you're only getting 4, and your buyer can't pay you the extra 1%, this is where you would put it. And we talk about we changed the contract to say purchase price, because remember, we used to be paid on gross. Commissions were always on gross. So what's purchase price? Gross. So you're always gonna be paid on purchase price, which is gross, which is what you were paid before. We just had to change that a little bit. But don't make it harder than it has to be. It's not that complicated. Read what it says. And when you are the listing agent and you get the agreement of sale, you have to make sure that you're watching this to see if the buyer is asking the seller to pay more towards their fee to their agent, or the buyer's asking for closing costs, like was traditional in deals of the past. For those of you that have been in business for a long time, now you say, well, if I have to ask the seller for an extra 1,000 in commission and 3,000 in closing costs, and I'm competing, yeah, your offer sucks. But if that's what your buyer needs, that's what you got to write. Now, a practice that I use is, if I know I'm writing that kind of deal and I'm working with an agent that I know, I'm going to call them. Philip, how many offers do you have? I have 10. Well, my first question is, do you have over asking? Yes. Well, I'm doing asking and asking for extra money. Now, technically, you might have to write the offer because your buyer doesn't have that trust in you. But a lot of times a buyer will say, you know what, I don't want you to go through putting all the paperwork together if you know we're not going to get it. Do you mind making a phone call? And some listing agents won't answer you. They'll say, you know what, write it, because they need your offer to escalate another offer. So if we just cooperated a little more with one another, I'm one of those listing agents that I don't want to present 10 offers if you're not going to beat the offers that I have. Like I'll tell you in a heartbeat, you're wasting your time, but if you need to do it, I understand, but I have more than that now. I don't give the amount that I have, but I do say I have more than that. You're wasting your time.
I do have another question, actually.
Go ahead. No, this is good.
So in play, conventional buyer, they can ask up to 3% in seller's assistance, right?
Whatever the lender will allow, yeah.
Or what it says 3%, right? So it probably doesn't really matter if I put the 3% in the co-op broker fee one above the co-op or above the
Yes, it
closing
will be.
costs. Well,
Paid by the broker for the buyer.
so they're paying a zero, that we agree to a zero fee.
Okay,
Like I could put the commission, we can ask for my fee. I can get paid by the buyer through the buyer accepting closing cost assistance.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So if they can only get up to 3% and they want the closing cost assistance, we would do 3%. I'm not.
I know, you're trying to get paid, the seller's not offering any commission. And they're allowed 3% seller's help, rather than it being seller's concession, it would go into his commission category.
no, it would still go here.
Okay.
And you gotta remember, his fee is one of their closing costs, and they got 3,000 in closing cost assistance. That money, the assistance that they get can be applied to all of their fees, one of which is his broker fee.
Closing cost assistance can be applied to the broker fee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cooperating compensation is broker to broker. Concessions is seller to buyer. Think of it that way. Concessions is seller to buyer. The seller is giving the buyer $3,000 to do what they want. What's one of the buyer's fees? Your fee. Just like they have the appraisal fee, just like they have the underwriting fee, just like they have title insurance costs. Your fee is one of the fees on their cost sheet. The seller gave them $5,000. That $5,000 could cover your fee. It goes against all their costs, one of which was your fee. Don't think of your fee other than just like a lender fee or whatever else. And if the seller's giving you co-op broker money, that goes directly towards your fee. If they're giving concessions, it goes to all of their fee. The net's the same. The buyer either needs to bring more money or they don't. Does that help? Remember, co-op broker compensation is between brokers. Concession is money the seller's given to the buyer to use however they want. Where are you getting into binds with this paragraph? What are you seeing? Are you doing it right? Are you receiving it wrong?
I see a lot of agents not understanding it and they'll do the co-op working form and then
Still
they'll
put the same number here.
the same amount there, which again.
That would be payment in
Payment is too, right? So, but it's just a matter of getting people educated and letting us know, like, we're in the right, here's the understanding of it, get rid of this out of it.
Right. So as the listing agent, just watch for that. If you
Yeah.
signed a co-op broker form and your seller signed this, technically you'd be on the hook.
If they do it through Dotloop or DocuSign, those numbers are small, like, you better really look at those two areas, cause you might miss them just the way that it inputs it and where it inputs it in the line. You could overlook it, so just make sure that you're really looking at those two.
And they're gonna be two different line items on the CD. So that's essentially, it's like, I have a listing right now.
Seller's assistant, yeah.
We offer 2% buyer agent commission. They ask for another 1 on the contract, is 1% above the co-op. So it'll be,
So on the Alta.
Yeah.
The seller has agreed to pay the broker for the buyer. And on the seller side of the Alta, it will say 1% to Keller Williams of Central PA.
Yeah.
And the seller will have 2% to Keller Williams of Central PA. You're, you get my company. Keller Williams Keystone, yeah. And you have to educate your title companies on this too. Because you want to make sure it matches what you've told. So on the seller's cost sheet, on your listing, if they took an offer, you're gonna show the 2% that the listing contract says, and then you're gonna show the 1% that they agreed to based on the agreement of sale. Following me?
yeah.
Because the 1% isn't getting paid to Keller Williams Keystone, it's getting paid to Caldwell Banker. Because you only have a contract with them to collect 2. The agreement of sale said they'll pay the broker for the buyer. If that is your company, it would go to Keller Williams Keystone. If it's Caldwell Banker or Remax or Iron Valley or Howard Hanna, then there would be a line on the seller side, 1% to Howard Hanna, 2% to Keller Williams Keystone. Then the total,
Yeah.
But title companies may just show that all going to Keller Williams Keystone, and technically you don't have a listing contract to collect the full amount, so you have to be watching your Altas. You should always review your Alta, whatever side you're on, at least 3 days before closing. It's not hard, but we have to think. And you know what? We make a ton of money for what we do. So none of this is rocket science, you don't have a doctorate degree, yet some people are making more than radiologists and heart surgeons selling real estate, so. Ignorance of the process is not a defense. We really have to think. It's not just filling out blanks anymore and collecting big paychecks, sorry. So is that what you're seeing? That's it? Anything else on this before we go to the listing contract? Okay.
I'm going to say, Rachel and I were sitting here talking, I am not doing buyer estimated cost sheets in Bright. I use the lenders, and I was always under the assumption that the lenders was the holy grail, and I go through that with my buyers and make sure they understand all the fees. I do not do it that way, but I love this and I'm going to start doing it. this
Take your
way.
lenders in there. Does your lender know that you charge the buyer $600 extra fee?
Yes.
Okay. Does your lender know that the buyer wanted to buy an enhanced title policy because you explained the difference to them and the lender only put it in a basic policy on theirs? But Bright gives you the option to pick enhanced or right. Does the lender know that the buyer elected all inspections and those costs need to be on there?
I just feel like it's.
So even if you're,
Sorry.
go ahead. Even if you're communicating if you have a great, it doesn't matter. The state wants to see it was prepared by you. You're responsible to give the buyer an estimated cost sheet. You can't take your responsibility and pass it on to a lender. There are brokers that will say they'll accept the lender's cost sheet as compliance with the state, but I guarantee you, if the state comes in, they may not agree with you.
But I also love it from the perspective of feeding back into the value and where our shift is coming in, and this is the fee of the service that you are getting on my behalf. That I'm not
Exactly.
illustrating that correctly to my clients in a monetary amount. So I like doing that, and then I like the credit back, but you're illustrating that for them. So that's my big takeaway so far.
At the time of the initial meeting, and you know they're in the $400,000 price range, and you're giving them just a cost sheet to show them what it will be. This is gonna be zero. But you're gonna tell them, but I'm gonna redo this for every house you find and put the number in here. But the worst case scenario is, if the seller isn't willing to give us squat, they know right up front, it's gonna cost me 40,000 instead of 30,000 to get in my dream, because you told them up front. And if they say, if the seller doesn't pay, we can't buy, then it's your responsibility to call the other agent and say, before I show you your house, are you offering anything? And if they say no, and your buyer tells you, don't show me that house, you're not boycotting that agent, you're not boycotting that seller, because you've done your buyer can't afford it, this is zero.
Now, I remember the older days when seller's help was very, very common, and in order to net, you would just add it on top, right? So
And you can still do that.
okay, and that would cover that $10,000 gap of them needing 40 now. You have that
Yeah.
conversation, and it's like, okay, we're gonna add 10 grand on top of the list price and ask for the 10 in concession.
So if I can afford the mortgage on 410,000, and you think the house will appraise, offer 410 on the 400 and put the 10,000 here, seller still gets 400. So, and I didn't want to get into this, but Ryan raises a good point. So what we were saying earlier, if I had to ask for an extra 1% commission and closing costs, my offer is hardly competitive. Well, if the house is on the market for 150, don't show your buyer. If you know your buyer needs that, search the MLS for homes that have been on the market 30, 60, 90 days. Do you think that seller is going to be more willing to give some help versus the one that just came on the market today? So figure out a way to get your buyer what they want, maybe, or they can afford more in the monthly payment, they just don't have the cash up front. So you just switch the numbers around, as long as you know it will appraise, bump the closing costs into the purchase price. All of that is not manipulation. It's not deceitful. It's everything on this paper is negotiable. Keep that in mind. And don't go back to agents because they do something differently than you do. As long as it's legal, every blank on there is negotiable between the buyer and seller.
I have a question. What else if I have a conventional buyer and I need more than 3%? I do 3% there. Can I do 1% transfer tax or what you normally do?
Sure,
Like
sure. The buyer can pay.
What else you can do to get more?
To get more money, raise the price. And ask for more closing costs.
Where
Then
I
you just purchase
They're
those.
saying if it's max it, you asking you to 3, where else can you pick up?
If, yes. Don't prorate taxes.
Oh,
The seller doesn't get the refund of the buyer doesn't have to pay the seller the taxes. Don't prorate HOA fees. I've seen that.
You write that in.
That's a good.
It's a good one.
It says here, at the time of settlement, the following will be prorated on a daily basis, reimbursable where applicable: rent, mortgages, condo fees, homeowners fees, water and sewer fees, municipal fees that are lienable. Everything that's prorated is listed there. Just say seller to pay, buyer to reimburse seller, no prorations or something like that.
Here's one that I like, or I stated.
Unless otherwise stated here, seller will pay, unless otherwise stated here, and that's where you put that the seller,
Won't
yeah. Seller won't get reimbursed. It's on there.
That's for a tip.
You're responsible to know every word on this contract, guys. Sorry, I don't want to be like the teacher with the stick browbeating you or the nun slapping your hands, but you have a license and you're responsible to know this stuff, so, and we all forget. Believe me. I'm the person to say, make many mistakes on my. So that, or the other thing is gifts from, they can receive gifts from family members.
Anyway,
And we gotta talk to the lender about that, because if you know you have that buyer and they're gonna buy in 3 months and they're not gonna have enough money, have the gift given now, because they wanna see, the banks wanna see that that money was in their bank account for at least it used to be 3 months, and they considered it seasoned money. I think, was it 3 months? Now it's 2, okay, it's 2 months, whatever. That's another thing we used to do, is get the gift now.
DHFA grant.
Grants, county grants, like Cumberland County offered that $5,000, and if you live in the house for 5 years, it's forgiven, or 3 years or something.
Parents. We had to go through that
Crypto, yeah, I don't know anything about cryptos.
whole month of crypto account. You have to show that you've had it for a certain amount.
Okay. So lenders will require that. So are we good with the agreement of sale? Anything else? That's a good question. You want to go to the listing contract now? And I think then there was something else you guys would here. Okay. So on the listing contract, everything's pretty much the same. You just put your fees in here like you always did. And then on page 2, you have to have the conversation with your seller. What do they want to do? Do they want to cooperate with other brokers, and how much? Or do they want to just give a concession amount? And can you advertise and negotiate concessions or no? So 6 and 7 is where your seller is telling you what they want to do, if they're willing to offer, and they're gonna ask you. That's the thing, they're gonna ask you. And it's okay to say you can do whatever you want. You don't have to pay anything. That's how I start out. You don't have to pay anything, but do you want to get your house sold? Because nobody's working for free. So you can offer a percentage, and that's the way it had been done, but it doesn't have to be. You can just say, look, I have a pot of money that I don't care what the price is. You're listing $1 million house, and they say, look, we're willing to get, and you can say to the seller, my fee is this. I get X percent. That's not negotiable, because that's what I work for. But as far as what you're willing to pay the buyer's agent, that's totally up to you. So if you want it, the thing you have to remember is page 2 corresponds with page 1, because if they're willing to, if you say, I'll list your house for 10% and I'll take 5 and I'll give the other agent 5, you can offer that to them. And if they say, yeah, that sounds good, then you would put 10% here and 5% on the second page. But if they say, we're only willing to pay you 5% and give 10,000 away, you don't want to put 10% here. You only put what you're getting there. You put the total amount here if they're willing to offer some of that. And it doesn't have to be 50-50, by the way. So don't call the association after you go to the settlement table and you see that the listing agent got 4 and you got 2. The listing agent told you by a phone call, by signing a co-op broker form, that you get 2. That doesn't mean they get 2. You're making an assumption. You get 2. And if 2 doesn't match your buyer's agency, you go back and tell your buyer you have to pay the difference. You are going to see more non-equal splits, I think, moving forward than ever before. You're already seeing it. Sellers agents are keeping more, and there's nothing illegal about that as long as you were paid what you were told you were paid, and as long as you were paid what's on the co-op broker form, you have nothing to complain about. If you need more money, ask your buyer for it, or change your buyer's agent's agreement. Or ask for it in the agreement of sale. So getting back to the listing contract, if there, okay, go ahead.
Thanks. I was under the impression that all commission must be negotiable. So if we say to a client, we will get 6% or eight, no, I will work for you for 8%. that's not negotiating. That's a statement of
Well,
fact.
It is.
No, you have every right as a business person to say, my fee is.
Okay,
My fee is, fees are negotiable, and my fee is 10%. Now, if you're the seller and you're savvy, you could say, well, you said it's negotiable, will you take 8? No,
In the
No.
negotiation.
well, I'm gonna go with Brian, because he'll take 8, okay? Or you say, okay, I'll take 8, because I don't wanna lose the listing. That's not illegal, and that's not saying it's not negotiable. You went over the consumer notice first, and you said fees and commissions are negotiable, the duration of how long I work for you is negotiable. And my fee is, as a business, you can set fees, right? Lawyers set fees.
Sure.
Attorney, doctors set fees, plumbers set fees, electricians set fees, realtors can set fees. You gotta start somewhere. Commissions are negotiable, and my fee is 10%. And if you pay me 10%, I'm willing to give the buyer's agent 4. I'm willing to give them 3. Or you don't want to pay a buyer's agent 5%. I'm getting 5 on my end. That's what I want to do this job.
so where that
And-
my hang up is this.
I'm role playing with you. by the
So,
way. I'm not saying this.
What
how it has to
that
be.
we were told by our attorneys at REAC is that, is that we're under the assumption that 6% is what got us in trouble in the first place. So if we're all saying that I will work for you for 6%, and that's it,
As long as you.
that is what got us in trouble.
No,
in the
this-
first.
No, that's not what got us in trouble. So what got us in trouble is we forced a seller to pay a buyer's agent. As long as there wasn't collusion among all the York brokers to charge the same fee, that's antitrust and that's collusion. That's collusion. That's not what happened. We forced the seller to pay a buyer's agent by offering a buyer's agent commission in the multi-list. That was the antitrust violation.
Okay.
Because the seller didn't have choice. Because they had to pay the buyer's agent something. That's what got us in trouble.
So
So
the
now the seller says,
the conversation between the agent and the seller, saying that I will work for you for 6%. When that the Missouri statement was, or whole situation was, that 6% is what was the standard norm for.
if you say those,
Then we're in an antitrust.
Yes.
situation.
say those words, because I had a class where the said, you can tell my sellers this is standard. You can't say those words. You can't say it three words. You can say this is my fee. The thing is, and by being members of Keller Williams, you have the best tools there are available. Gary Keller and them have they have scripts for that you can, videos, tons of them that you can watch and see how you express your value as a seller's agent and as a buyer's agent and get the commission that you want and deserve, because these are the values you're presenting. I mean, they give it all to you. They give you the whole plan to do it. So my point is, just don't cut yourself short. If they're willing to pay part of their, if they're willing to give part of the fee to a co-op broker, make sure the total's on page 1, because you're giving a portion of it away on page 2. Are you following me? If they're not willing to give anything to the buyer's agent but a couple bucks, then your fee goes on page 1, what you want to collect, and then their concession goes on number 7.
So not that it's a great idea,
And
but
that's what you would communicate to the other agent, either the amount or the concession. So to finish that thought.
so as a business model, like I can, if I want to say to my sellers, my business model is I accept 10% for me,
Yeah,
and I only work with sellers who will offer a co-op. Can I do that?
absolutely, if that's your business model.
Okay,
But if they say, well, we don't like that,
right,
so would you agree to do this? Now the ball's been
Right.
volleyed back to
Okay.
you. You have to let your seller know it's all negotiable. And it's okay to say, and my fee is X. my model is X, that's not wrong. But if you say, I follow the standard model, then you're,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Oh, Phil, sorry, Phil.
Yeah, so what I thought we cannot say to sellers, well, is, if you don't offer a buyer agent commission, agents most likely won't show your house. We can't say that to sellers, right?
You really, yeah, there could be impacts, because if about, what you could say is there could be impacts of.
That's course.
You don't have to pay anything. But that may impact the traffic you get through your house, because if a buyer can't afford to pay their agent. Then, but if the seller says, well, I'll consider it.
Because this is why it's just what I struggle with, right? My fee's 3%, whatever, on the list side. Here are the pros and cons of paying a buyer agent commission. One of the cons of paying a buyer agent commission is, like, no one wants to say it apparently, but it is true that buyers want representation. And they'll probably gonna tell the real estate agents, like, hey, I don't even want to look at houses unless they're paying your fee. You know what
You
I'm
could
saying?
say
The
a
buyers
buyer's-
are gonna steer away from the houses.
Yeah.
The agents aren't gonna steer, the buyers are gonna steer away.
You could say to a seller, the buyers may instruct their agents to only show them homes
Okay.
that are offering a commission, because that's a true statement. A
Yeah.
buyer may instruct their agent, and that's not an illegal instruction of a principal to an agent.
So,
You just can't say your house won't be shown. It's possible it could impact showings, because you don't have a crystal ball.
I also feel like,
Because the buyers could be willing to pay their agents, you don't know.
yeah,
Over the years, I've had buyers pay me. No, you were next, go ahead.
So. For a team model. Example, can team members. Together, can we, insist that we say we will only work for 6%? Isn't that collusion? And if that's collusion, then we have a problem.
Well, you're in the same company, it's not separate companies.
Well,
You're in the same company, your company can have a policy.
Everything's negotiable, so you could say that my fee is 6%. And then, like, I can't say that, we can't make that mandatory. Like, if someone comes in and says, well, I'm gonna pay you 4, you can choose not to work with them if you don't wanna pay.
Well, your brokerage could have a policy that you don't take with minimum, yeah, you could have a minimum, yeah.
But you're on the same team too, so
Yeah.
you're
You're not-
not outside agents, you're colluding.
Yeah.
Collusion requires two separate companies trying to set a standard.
never mind.
I have a question here, and it says, so if my sellers wanna sign this, for example, they accept 2.5 cooperation, and seller compensation, they don't know yet until the offer comes. So once I have an offer and I have a 4,000, for example, seller, do I go back, what I put in number A or B? The 4,000 seller credit.
So let's look at sometimes offer to make financial concessions towards buyers cost of settlement. Seller concessions could be used to pay for any costs incurred by the buyer. This is what I just said. As acceptable by the mortgage lender, including brokerage fees charged by the broker working with the buyer. Any seller concession must be negotiated, included in the agreement of sale. We talked about that in order to be binding between the seller and the buyer. Because remember, concessions are seller to buyer. So where do seller and buyer agree on things? In the agreement of sale. So all this makes sense and it's logical. Even though a co-op broker fee or a portion of it may be paid by the seller, the cooperating broker will continue to represent the buyer. So even though the seller's paying concessions and some of that money could go towards the buyer broker fee, that buyer broker still represents the buyer. That was the other part of the lawsuit. The sellers were paying for someone who didn't represent them and worked against them. The Justice Department said, that's crazy. Why should sellers pay for someone to work against them? So it's very clear to your seller that Even though they may have paid fees that are being paid to the co-op broker, they still represent the interest of the buyer. Then it says, in addition to cooperating compensation offered by the broker, because cooperating compensation is broker to broker. So in addition to what I told them, I'll share my commission up here, the seller is willing to consider negotiations in which the buyers may request seller concessions, unless otherwise stated here. If your seller says, I'm giving you 10%, you're splitting it 5 and 5, I'm not paying another dime, then you would write here, seller will not consider any other additional concessions beyond what's noted in this agreement. You know, noted above, whatever. Have your lawyer write that. Then it goes on to where we can advertise that. Can we advertise if they did want to do concession? So seller authorizes the broker to advertise or otherwise inform buyers and their brokers of the willingness to negotiate, including up to a maximum. So your seller can say, I'm not paying any money, any percent of the sale price. I'm just willing to give up to $10,000. And up to $10,000 means if the lender will allow it, or there's enough to cover all the buyer's agency fees. So, from the purchase price, it's fully negotiable in the agreement of sale. I lost my train of thought. So the seller's willing to negotiate concessions, including a maximum amount of the purchase price. Amount is fully via the MLS, via the MLS, any other method of marketing or communication authorized by this contract unless specified here. I'm not sure that means you can advertise that in the multi-list.
You can put.
The concessions is in the multi-list, right? The concessions, so if they say, if they're not offering a commission, they can put concessions equals yes in Bright. When this was written, we originally thought that Bright was gonna put a dollar amount, but they didn't. So this would just allow you to put the yes in Bright.
So
Now,
can you not?
this is a gray area that let me just finish this thought. When I'm offering compensation, so let's say I took a 10% listing, the seller agreed to split it 5 and 5, I'm gonna put the 5 here. And this is all blank. This says that they're willing to consider concessions unless otherwise stated here. So if we get the agreement of sale and they offered us 10,000 more and want 10,000 in closing costs, they agreed they'll look at it. So normally I leave this blank, but I still put a no in Bright under concessions because my seller didn't say they were willing to give concessions specifically. They're willing to negotiate. So I'm not going to put a yes in there because that means they will pay concessions. So in Bright, I put a no, and I call you or text you and say, your co-op compensation on this property is 5%. If I'm not giving any compensation and I'm just giving a dollar amount, then I'm going to put in the multi-list, yes. Where I've gotten the mistakes is agents see the no and think they're not getting paid. That no is concessions. They gotta call me to see if there's any other payment to sell my listing. Does that make sense? So if your seller isn't giving just pure cash, I think it's best to put no in the multi-list, but that's up to you guys. I mean, if you know you have the ability to pay a co-op compensation fee, that's gonna be on the CBC, that's gonna come with the agreement of sale. Does that help? It depends on how your seller wants to compensate the other party, or if they want to say up front, they're willing to help the seller, the buyer with closing costs.
But I already received an agreement of sale with 4,000 seller credit, and my.
So you don't have to come back.
I don't have to come back.
No. Well, the agreement of sale can be changed to be any, they can change their mind
I
altogether.
need to come back to change 4,000.
No. You don't, the agreement of sale is what they agree to. You don't, I see what you're saying. You're asking me, do you have to come back?
If they.
Like,
Edit your agreement with buyers. On the buyer's agreement, you do, exactly. And that gets a little confusing, but on the buyer's, agreement, it's gonna take more than you agreed to, you have to change that. The seller wants to give concessions,
You don't have to.
So you said in the MLS, they just allow a space to put yes.
No.
So you can't put it in like this. Yeah, you can't put it in there.
No.
Not the concessions, the concessions, I thought you could. Yeah, that's what.
You can give us that. Allow them. I think you could put that in agent remarks that the seller is willing to give $10,000 in
And
concession.
concession, you can't.
Yeah, because they didn't give us a field for dollar amount. After the fact, when you close the listing, then you put the amount in, and that's there for appraisal purposes. Any other problems you're having with the listing contract? What are you seeing just in general? Are your sellers willing to pay fees? Because you've expressed your value and it makes sense to them. Have you had a pushback from a seller that says, I'm not paying anything?
I do have a question, like, when you talk about fees, sometimes you're asked, well, what percentage should I pay to the buyer?
Ask them what they want to pay. You can say, in the past, I've seen on
Okay.
my listings, you can't say standard
Okay.
is this.
I just want to.
You have to be careful. Yeah, you can't say the standard is.
Right, I said, that's a lot I'm seeing on, but.
I think we got through. Gary, I had a question, sure, from one of the people online. So if the seller is offering 3% concession and the buyer uses that for paying their agent, their buyer agent, does the CBC need to be corrected, or is there? It was all concessions, there is no CBC. Okay, so you don't have to get the buyer to sign off on anything that states that they're allowing this 3% concessions. It was in the agreement of sale that the seller and the buyer agreed to. Okay. Remember, concessions, seller, buyer, where do seller and buyer sign the agreement of sale? Co-op broker, between broker and broker, where's that notice? CBC. Just keep telling yourself those things. Cooperating broker requires a CBC. Concessions is in the agreement of sale. You can have a combination. You still need concessions because your buyer needs closing cost help. You can still do seller's assistance like we always did before. Well, we used to when the market wasn't so hot. The appraisal contingency addendum isn't here. If she wants to add that, if somebody can pull that. You got it? Okay. It's not in your, it's in your packet. It just wasn't on here. That's fine. The best way I can describe this is option one is the old appraisal contingency addendum that always said, if the house doesn't appraise or the purchase price or whatever number you put up there, and buyer and seller can't come to terms, buyer can terminate the agreement and get their money back, period. That's the old appraisal contingency addendum, word for word. So option one is, if you want to secure your buyer's deposit and the house doesn't appraise and you can't negotiate with the seller to agreeable terms, your buyer gets their money back, end of story, period, the end. You don't use that if the buyer is willing to pay the gap. Number two is when they're willing to pay a gap. So the house was listed for 400, you escalated to 450. You told the listing agent, as long as it appraises for 420, they'll give you 450. So at the top, you would say the appraised value of the property must be equal to or higher than 420. That's the minimum it has to appraise for. Then they elect option 2B. And option 2B says, if the minimal amount is met, so if 420 is met, let's say it appraised at 421. The buyer accepts the property and agrees to the release, and they will complete the purchase at the purchase price. So it appraised at 421. What's the buyer giving the seller? 450. Yes, 450. So you use option 2 when you want to present to your seller the gap. Then you say, what happens if it appraises at 419? That's the very last, number 3. If the minimal isn't met, this addendum is no more. You go back to the mortgage contingency, which had a loan to value component, where you wrote in there that it had to appraise at a percentage of that minimum to, so you have your loan to value amount. It's that LTV. Now stay with me here, because this gets a little complicated, but you should know this. So now your LTV component wasn't met. So can a buyer terminate the contract based on the finance contingency, paragraph 8? No, no. There's nothing in that paragraph that says buyer may terminate if my LTV isn't met. However, if closing comes and goes, and the buyer didn't complete closing, and they had that mortgage contingency filled out correctly, they're not in default, and the seller would have to give them their money back, but they'd have to wait till technically the settlement date. So you can't fill out a termination and release form based on paragraph 8, because there's nothing in that paragraph that says buyer can terminate if these terms aren't met. However, think about it. If it doesn't appraise, so if you want to get your money, so let's say that scenario. You put 420 in here, it appraised at 419, you can't come to terms. You can't come up to a new price, you can't negotiate. You could do a release of the buyer's deposit, but you wouldn't do a termination and release form, the combined form. You would do a release and see if the seller will sign it. Does the seller really want to keep their house off the market? Probably not. They'll probably give the buyer their money back. If they want to keep their house, if they want to wait till closing, so they're tied up, they can't sell the house to somebody else, because so your buyer doesn't come to closing. The loan to value component of the finance contingency wasn't met. They're technically not in default, and at settlement, they would get their money back. That very rarely happens, but that's how the process would be.
So this was explained to us when this came out. Option B is you're buying it no matter what.
Yes.
That is how that was explained.
If the minimum value is met, you're buying it at the purchase price. Now, is that clear before we take it one step further? Because the other confusion with this is, but we have to know this stuff, right? You're the expert. So, oh yeah, you can always negotiate the price. Try to renegotiate based on the appraisal. Maybe the buyer says, you know what, that appraiser is wrong. I feel it's wrong. I'm paying the full price anyway. You've had buyers say, I don't care what the appraiser is. So they'll go ahead and pay it. What do you do if you want to show a gap? So the purchase price, the sale price of the house is 400. You're competing. You wrote an escalation clause that you'll pay $1,000 more up to a max of 450. And you're willing to do a gap of $30,000. But you don't know what to put up here because you don't know what you're going to be escalated to. What if you're only escalated to 440 and you did a 30,000 gap? Then this would be 410, right? If you're escalated to 450, this will be 420. How do you fill this out until you know what you escalated to? You following me? Is everybody following me? You can write on here, and again, pick up the phone and call the listing agent and tell them, we're willing to do a $30,000 gap. So I wrote in here $30,000 below final agreed upon escalated price. And then, once I know that number, I'll send you over another form which we can sign. But it's called picking up the phone and advocating for your buyer and talking to the listing agent and letting them know why you're sending this over with verbiage in it. Because one, I'm escalating, and until I know that we won and how much we had to pay, I don't know what number to use to subtract $30,000 from. So I'm putting here $30,000 less than final agreed upon escalated price, and you can even write a new addendum to follow once we know final price.
You know,
Makes
the problem,
sense?
it all makes sense, and I think you're dealing with a lot of professionals here that can understand that kind of thing, but just barely. So the problem is, unless your consumer really trusts you, it's hard to know that you're gonna come even close to explaining it to them in a way that they understand.
You have to figure out where they are in the process and what they know, because the worst thing is to have not told them anything, and then you're throwing surprises on them, because that's when the mistrust factor comes in with you. And then so you have to take it really slowly with them, and it's time consuming. And when we were doing multiple offers, buyers were often feeling like they were shafted because they didn't know that's how it would work. So I talk to them sometimes ad nauseum of, I put it on paper, I do a chart, I say, look, if we go in at this could happen. And I fully explain it to them, and sometimes they just get it and sometimes they
Right,
don't.
yeah.
But they are depending on you to know how to advocate for them, unfortunately, yeah.
Right,
And the other problem is that I thought you were gonna say, what's your name?
Brian.
Brian, I thought you were gonna say was, what do you do when you know this inside and out and you're dealing with a listing agent who's clueless?
Yeah.
And their ignorance costs their seller money, because if they would have listened to you and done it your way, and now your buyer lost a house, their seller lost money. Their seller could potentially sue them for breach of fiduciary duty because your offer was the highest and best, but you were working with somebody incompetent who didn't know. When you face that incompetence, you can first always work with agent to agent. If you reach a level of incompetence that you feel is interfering with the seller's total bottom line, even though you don't represent the seller, it is totally appropriate to call their broker and say, your agent doesn't get it, and they're costing their seller money. Do you want to be on the lawsuit where the seller finds out and they sue you because you breached their fiduciary duty? What's your duty to the seller? Get the highest and best and the most. And by taking your offer, it would have, but the agent didn't understand. And you can try to be patient. You know, I had a new agent on a team and she was arguing with me. And because she didn't make her offer contingent upon the settlement of the buyer's home. And I did some research because she said they're buying my house with an FHA offer. And it just seemed funny that they're buying with an FHA offer and they don't have to sell the house they're in. So I researched their name based on the address that came in on the contract. I went to the county records. I saw that they had an existing FHA mortgage. So I called the lender and I said, you wrote a pre-approval that they don't have to sell their house. They have an FHA loan. You can't have two. Sometimes you can. There's an exceptions to when you can have two FHA loans, but they're rare. So she said, but they're not gonna have their house because they're settling at 9 o'clock on theirs and 10 o'clock on yours. Oh my God. So the lender didn't get it. I called the agent 3 times. She didn't get it. She was 20 years old. She said, your voice is going up and I feel threatened. So she said, your voice is going up and I'm feeling threatened. I said, yeah, because I explained this to you 10 times and I'm losing my patience. So she said, I'm gonna hang up and I'm gonna have my team leader call you. Great, never call me now, you know? So the team leader calls and says, what's going on? I said, it is contingent. Oh, I told her to do that because they were selling her. She said, totally my fault. You're right. Like The team leader is giving her wrong leads. So you just can't deal with stupid over and over. Sometimes you just have to go above it, but always, always, out of professionalism and professional courtesy, go to the other agent, try to explain to them that your strategy is a win-win strategy for everybody. And if they don't get it, and you really feel strongly that the seller is losing money, or leaving money on the table, it's okay to go to their broker. So that's how this is designed to be used. The first one is the old fashioned. My buyer will buy the house as long as it appraises. If it doesn't appraise, I want to get them their money back. That's the key. There's nothing in paragraph 8 that if the mortgage contingency terms aren't met, that the buyer can use paragraph 8 as a release. This allows them to get their money back based on just the appraisal. So if they're conservative and they want their money back, again, does it make your offer weaker in a competing situation? Yes, but it doesn't matter. You got to protect your buyer. If they want their money back, if it doesn't appraise, then you got to use this form, option 1, and put the purchase price up top. Even though it says purchase price unless otherwise stated, I just reiterate the purchase price up there. I think that's the safest way.
Use for conventional.
Conventional, why do you think this is only for conventional and not FHA or VA? The government has laws on FHA and VA. You sign VA and FHA amendatory clauses that say if the house doesn't appraise, the buyer doesn't have to buy it. You can't use a form to override a government form. So because FHA and VA have those amendatory forms we fill out that specifically say buyer does not have to proceed with purchase if it doesn't appraise, that's why it's only for conventional. Because a lender doesn't care if the buyer comes up with more money. Remember, the lender is only going to lend based on the appraised value. So in our example of 420, the lender is only going to give them 90% of 420. So that's what it is appraised. If they want to pay 450, they have to come up with the extra $30,000. All the lender's going to do in that case, they'll still give them the loan as long as they can show they have the extra $30,000 in funds. Does that help?
The time there, are you supposed to do until settlement, until you would expect your appraisal report? What?
30, yeah, you got to look at settlements sooner than 30 days. Don't accept this at 30 days because then they have till closing. So you'd want to adjust that. You want it at least, I would say 10 days before closing, at least, if not 2 weeks.
To go.
No, because then how do you negotiate at the last minute? Yeah, you'd never want to run this out through closing, at least a minimum, I would think, a week. Because if you got in touch with the lender and the lender got in touch with the ACA, the appraisal management company, who's the intermediary, like that could take a while to get the appraiser. The problem is it's hard to get an appraiser to change their mind. Like they have a lot of power. It's hard to tell them you're wrong when you change the appraisal. However, I don't know if you're aware of this, there's a new law that consumers have the ability to, the consumer can, every mortgage company has to provide forms to the consumer to challenge their appraisal and they can get comps. It's something new that just came out. It was on BAR that's listed. They had a seminar with that woman from Pittsburgh. Who's an appraiser, she was talking about it, and I can't remember the words, but mortgage companies have to provide the ability for the buyer to challenge the appraisal if they feel it was done incorrectly, and we can provide comps. And appraisers can even look at pending sales if they're going to be closing soon and they know that it's a solid transaction. I didn't know. Anything else? I think we're beyond our time, but here's yes. So go ahead.
This one for price escalation. So I hear if you have like 5 offers, you always do, you of course you take the best for your seller, but I hear in one training that you don't have to, if you don't have something to back up, like something like, I don't know, 100 and the next one was 105, you can always get the 105 without having 100.
Remember, everything's negotiable. So if buyers demand 105, that's the only offer the seller has. The seller could go back to that buyer and say, then pay me 105. But the buyer will say, well, I was only willing to pay you 105 if I was escalated. I don't care. I'm counting you at 105. Remember, everything's negotiable. So when you do an escalation clause, you're showing your cards to the seller. Did you learn something today? Good. Awesome. Derek, appreciate it. You talked to several. All right, cut you so long. We're gonna talk a little bit. Makes it more authentic. Did the same, I was gonna answer this. You were watching, I wasn't watching.
Yeah, I was getting text.